Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about antitrust in the context of public opinion, because public opinion, of course, shapes our laws, and sometimes it even shapes the way the Supreme Court decides issues. As Mr. Dooley, who was a fictional character of Peter Finley Dunn, a great satirist, once said, "The Supreme Court follows the election returns." And in the 1890s, after the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, we were in the midst of what was called the progressive period, the progressive era, in which resistance to big monopolies, to big business, to big conglomerates had grown. And there was a sentiment against trusts and trust busting. And there was even a fear that the big monopolies of the steel industry, the railway industry, and the oil industry controlled the Senate of the United States. And that distrust of bigness, especially of big business, was one of the motivating factors of that period. It was a time in which the sentiment was also driven by a new wave of investigative journalism. That's Ida B. Tarbell, pictured there. She was one of a group of journalists, investigative journalists, who became very popular, especially in the popular magazines at the time, like McClure's magazine. And here's her cover story on John D. Rockefeller. It was actually the 14-part series that ends up becoming a book. And Ida Tarbell's father had been in business, in sort of the energy business, and he was put out of business, destroyed by the Standard Oil Company. And so Ida Tarbell decided that she was going to write an investigative series for the popular press on John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. She was one of a group known as the Muckrakers in the progressive era. The Muckrakers were a whole bunch of pretty famous journalists and writers, some of them novelists also. But there's Upton Sinclair in the top right, and Jacob Riis, who wrote about the slums of New York. Upton Sinclair wrote about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. Lincoln Steffens wrote The Shame of Our Cities. He's there. And then Frank Norris wrote a book called The Octopus. You remember all those tentacles in the octopus they always use in the editorial cartoons? Well, that was his book was about the railway cartels. And of course, there's Ida Tarbell, who writes her series for McClure's magazine on Standard Oil. And it comes out in 1902. It's serialized. It's still running in 1903. And it's riling up public opinion. McClure's magazine, The History of Standard Oil, Ida B. Tarbell, and it's a very well-reported, fact-driven narrative history, but it also shows step by step. It exposes all the things that Standard Oil, and by extension, big corporations were doing at the time in order to gain monopolies. It had a huge impact. And she later said, I never had an animus against their size and their wealth. In other words, it's not just about bigness. I never objected to their corporate form. I was willing that they should combine and grow as big and as wealthy as they could, but only by legitimate means. But they never played fair, and that ruined their greatness for me. And so the backlash that happens because of these muckraking journalists ends up being reflected not only in the law, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, but also eventually in the decisions of the Supreme Court. Thanks.